Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to start off our adventure at the Lincoln Home Site, the historical site. So today we are going inside to take a tour of his house. Um,
And as you can see, here's the visitor center. And Mason was going in. Oh, he's handing off the backpack. Nana's got the backpack, and there they go inside the visitor center.
Join us on our tour today, he would actually recognize much of his old neighborhood back here. But some of those boards are a little uneven, so just watch your step as we're going back and forth to the house today. Same is true for the curbs. There are no ramps built into the curbs, so just watch your step up and down off the curbs. When we are inside the house, on the first floor, there will be a handrail out in front of you. If you need to lean against something, or if you want to get a better look at something, you are welcome to be against that handrail as much as you might want to be or need to be. What I'll ask that you not do, though, again, is be against walls, doors, or door frames. When we are upstairs, we don't have a railing anymore. We have a narrow blue carpet. That blue carpet's kind of our safe zone upstairs, and we'll just ask that everybody stay on that carpet. There are motion sensors in the house, and occasionally the motion sensor alarms do go off if somebody strays a little too far off the carpet. So just know if you hear that alarm, I'm just going to remind everybody where they need to be, and we go about our tour. It's nothing more exciting than that. You know, SWAT team doesn't show up. It's, you know, it's pretty not too exciting, but just know that if you do hear the alarm, that's kind of protocol for that. So your tickets, they should be stamped for 9 o'clock. I won't collect those from you. You can hang on to those, but keep them handy for just the next couple of minutes because I do need to see them before you go into the home, and I will remind you of that when we get over there in just a second. Finally, guys, ask me questions. I volunteer my time here, and I do that because I love helping you guys to learn about Mr. Lincoln, about his time here in Springfield, and just about his life in general. So please, at any point during the tour, feel free to ask should you have questions, okay? All right, with all of those things now behind us, is everybody ready to go? Yes. All right, follow me. All right, everyone. This is the only house that Abraham Lincoln ever owned. He purchased it in 1844, and he bought it from a man here in Springfield named Charles Dresser. Mr. Dresser was a preacher, and in fact, it had been the Reverend Dresser who had performed the marriage ceremony of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd 2 years prior to Lincoln buying the house. So when he purchased it in 1844, he gave the handsome sum of $1,500 for the house. $1,200 was in cash. The other $300 he made up for. He had a piece of property on the west side of town, so he deeded that over as well. It was worth about $300. So that made up the difference in the transaction, and he paid again $1,500 for the house. Now, when he and Mary moved in the spring of 1844, they just had one son, Robert. He was 9 months old at the time, but the house was not yet a full 2 stories like we see it today. It looked very much like that little house right over there on the corner with the green shutters and the white fence out front. It was a 1.5-story cottage, and it had a 4.5-foot loft upstairs. So over the years that the Lincolns lived here, as you can see, they made a few improvements. We're going to talk about some of those when we get inside in just a moment. The Lincolns are going to spend 17 years here. They'll have 3 more sons born to them while they lived here. They'll lose one of those sons while they live here. And one of the most historic things to happen in Springfield, we could argue in the country, happened right within these walls. So we'll talk about that when we get inside as well. So remember, I need to see your ticket as you come through the door. All I'm going to do is just look at that timestamp, and then those tickets are yours to do with as you choose after the tour today. Is everyone ready to spend some time with the Lincolns?
Yes.
All right. Come in here kind of to the middle of the room, but much as you guys want to be or need to be. All right, everyone, welcome to the home of Abraham and Mary Lincoln. We are now in the formal parlors, and you might have guessed that just by taking a look around. These are the nicest 2 rooms in the house. This is where the Lincolns would have had their best furniture, their nice things that they wanted to show off. This is really where they put their best foot forward. It's where you would have done your formal entertaining, where Mr. Lincoln a little later on would have had political meetings and meetings with his law clients and so forth. So again, nicest 2 rooms in the house right here. But I mentioned just a minute ago that when they first moved in, they didn't have the full 2nd story. They only had the story-and-a-half cottage. What is now the rear parlor, that's the room off to the right back there, until 1856, that room was a bedroom. It was the only bedroom in the house with a ceiling higher than 4.5 feet, because the other bedrooms upstairs had that little loft space, right? So you see these doors, for those of you that are on this side, you can see these big black walnut doors in the middle of the room that are folded back. Those are original to the home. They could have closed those doors to separate that bedroom from the parlor area up front here. We talked about the fact that they had 1 son when they moved in, Robert, he was just a baby, and that 3 more sons came along while the Lincolns lived here. Where are my Lincoln fans who can name those 3 boys in the order that they joined the Lincoln family? They already had Robert. Who came next? So Tad did come along, but he wasn't next. But we'll go with that. We're naming boys. So we've got Robert and Tad. Who are the other 2? Willie and Eddie. Right. Very good. So we've got them all named. Now here's the order. After Robert was Eddie, then Willie, and then Tad. Okay? Tad's born in 1853. It's another 3 years before the Lincolns put on that full 2nd story. And remember, that's a bedroom until 1856. Why does all that matter? Because it means Eddie, Willie, and Tad were born in that back bedroom back there. You know, think of the good memories for the Lincolns and the excitement and the joy and the pride of welcoming those new little boys into their family. But I told you outside, too, that they lost one of those little boys. That was Eddie. Eddie was almost 4. He was a couple of weeks away from turning 4 years old when he passed away in February 1850 from tuberculosis. Eddie's funeral was held in the front parlor right up here. So just within the space of the first couple of minutes we've been together here in the house, the first 2 rooms you've seen in the house, we've taken an emotional roller coaster ride with the Lincolns. Right? Think about that. From one extreme to the other on the emotion spectrum for them here. And remember that they spent 17 years here. They made a lot of memories here. And they left a lot of things for us to think about and to learn from. We talked about a historic event happening here. I probably won't surprise a lot of you when I tell you that was in 1860. The Republican National Convention was held in Chicago that year. Mr. Lincoln did not travel to Chicago for the convention. He stayed here in Springfield. But a delegation from the convention came here after it was over to meet with Mr. Lincoln. He knew they were coming. He knew what they wanted to talk to him about. It was really a formality. They came to ask him in person to be the Republican candidate for president that year. So they would have come here to the house in Springfield. They would have been welcomed into these 2 parlor rooms. Remember, this is where you do all of your formal entertaining and meetings and so forth. And so that meeting with those gentlemen and that conversation would have taken place right here where we're standing. We are literally standing where history happened. Kind of neat to think about. All right, as we move through the house today, I mentioned we do have several Lincoln artifacts here in the house, so I'll point out some of those as we move through the rooms. So off to the far left, up here in the front parlor, there's a marble top table underneath a mirror that belonged to the Lincoln family. All of the upholstered furniture in these 2 rooms, so anything you could sit on, chairs, sofas, all of those belonged to the Lincolns with only one exception. The exception is this large rocking chair right here in front of me. It is a period rocker, but not a Lincoln piece. All of the others, though, did belong to the Lincolns. So that includes in the rear parlor, that long sofa back there against the wall. That's one of my favorite pieces. I love to picture Mr. Lincoln stretched out on that. He's got his feet up on one end, you know, he's in his stocking feet, and he's got his feet up on one end. He's reading a newspaper or reading a book. He was an avid reader. He read everything aloud. Said it helped him to remember what he read. Speaking of reading, there's also a bookcase in this rear parlor back here in the corner that belonged to Mr. Lincoln, and there is one book in it that belonged to Mr. Lincoln. So okay, we'll point out some of those things as we go through the house. So these formal parlors we've talked about, Nicest two rooms in the house. Look at all the breakable things in here. Any idea who might not have been allowed in these two rooms? Just any wild guesses? Tad, maybe. Maybe Willie, maybe any of their friends, kids in general. If you know anything about those youngest two Lincoln boys, Willie and Tad, you know that they didn't really have many rules. Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln really didn't believe much in disciplining their boys. They pretty much gave them free rein. But Mrs. Lincoln did not permit them in these two rooms. And it's for occasions like we talked about, like that meeting with the gentleman out of Chicago. So they want to keep these the presentable rooms of the house, but the boys spent a good deal of time in the sitting room. We're going to catch up there next and talk in just a moment. But as you make your way to the sitting room, you'll walk through the Lincoln's dining room, and you'll see the table and chairs that belonged to Abraham and Mary Lincoln. Are there questions here? Anyone? All right, make your way around to the right, and I'll meet you in the sitting room. This is a smaller room. We'll probably have to double up the line a little bit. Remember, you can be up against that rail as much as you want to be or need to be. Just not against walls, doors, or door frames. All right, everyone. So, welcome to the sitting room or family room. And this really is where the Lincolns spent time together as a family. So that did include the boys. That included their friends. That included the family pets. The Lincolns loved animals. They had a big yellow lab mixed dog. His name was Fido. And any number of cats would have been in and about this house. Abraham Lincoln was especially fond of cats and kittens. He would pick up stray kittens on his walks home from his law office about 5 blocks away here, scoop them up, bring them home to live out their, 9 happy lives here with the Lincoln family. So we get a sense of a very lively space in this room and a lot of really good memories for the Lincoln family. Mrs. Lincoln loved to sew. Over to the far right, you see a mirror on the wall. That belonged to the Lincolns, and so did the table beneath it. That is one of her sewing tables. On the left-hand side on the table, there are a couple of notable items. One being the chess set. It is not original, but it is a reproduction of a set that Mr. Lincoln owned. And next to it, there's a large box, wooden box with eyepieces. That is called a stereoscope. That is the original stereoscope that Mr. Lincoln purchased for his sons in 1859. Mr. Lincoln loved spoiling his boys. It was something that he did not experience himself as a child, and he was happy to do so for his boys. And him buying them that gift would have been the talk of the neighborhood for the kids, at least, because if we could think about it in today's terms, it would be like Mr. Lincoln buying the latest video game system for his boys. A pretty high-tech toy, popular toy, and not many kids would have had one because they were very expensive. Mr. Lincoln paid $20 for that. We'll compare prices when we get upstairs in a few minutes, but again, think of it as if it were today, and he walked in with the latest video game system, okay? But he loved spoiling those boys. All of the wood that's around the fireplace is original to the home. So on the mantle you see the candles and all of the china and the finery sitting up there. Just underneath all of that, on the thin little facing strip off to the right, you might see some dark little specks. Those are actually holes in that mantle wood. Picture this room on Christmas Eve. Snow's falling outside, that prairie wind is howling out there, blowing all the snow around, but it's nice and warm in here because the Lincolns have a fire blazing away in that fireplace. Fido and a bunch of cats are curled up there in front of the fire to keep warm. And Abraham Lincoln is nailing up Christmas stockings right there on that mantle for his boys. Christmas of 1860 is the last the family spends here in the house because, of course, he's President-elect Lincoln by then, and they're going to be living in the White House just a few short weeks later. Willie Lincoln had just turned 10 just a few days before Christmas that year, and Tad was 7. That had to be a super exciting Christmas for those Lincoln boys. But even on that really exciting Christmas Eve, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln still had to get those boys off to bed at some point. The bedrooms are all upstairs. We're going to head up there in just a minute. On your way up the stairs, please hold on to the handrail. It is original to the home. So every time Abraham Lincoln went up or down these stairs, one of his hands was on this handrail somewhere. It's kind of like as close as any of us are going to get to shaking hands with Abraham Lincoln, right? One of my colleagues likes to tell his groups that it's the only original Lincoln artifact that you can touch in Springfield and not get in trouble for it. So there's a little bit of truth to that, too. All right, well, we're going to head upstairs. On your left is a guest bedroom, and the bed that is in that room did belong to the Lincoln family. And then we're going to catch up again across the hall upstairs in Mr. Lincoln's room. Ready to go? All right. Lincoln's half of the master bedroom suite. Mrs. Lincoln's room is behind me, and I'll tell you more about it in just a moment. First things first, you probably noticed the wallpaper in here. It's a little hard not to notice the wallpaper in here. Here's what I want you to know about it. It is the color and pattern that the Lincolns had on their walls in these two rooms. We know that because in 1988, the National Park Service was renovating the house. It was the last major renovation that's been done to date here at the house. And they were working in Mr. Lincoln's bedroom here. And they found a swatch of wallpaper. They were down to the original wall structure, kind of the lath, right, in the wall. And they found a scrap of wallpaper from 1856. The curators got really excited about that, of course, and they went off and did some research. And what they learned was that it had come from Paris. So it was imported European wallpaper, probably expensive, right, to purchase in 1856, but let's put that into context. By 1856, Abraham Lincoln was making a good living as an attorney, right? He was pretty successful. They could afford to have a few nice things as they finally completed the full second-story addition of their house here. We also have to consider that Mrs. Lincoln was particularly fond of anything French. You know, she kept up with fashion trends and decor trends like many ladies did at the time, but again, she had kind of a particular affinity for anything French. She could speak fluent French. She could read French. In fact, she had 12 years of formal schooling. That was almost unheard of for a man at that time, let alone a woman. So she was, quite a bit ahead of her time in that way. And so you put all those things together, it makes sense why she would have selected the Parisian wallpaper for these two rooms. In terms of furnishings in the rooms, so the bed is a beautiful piece. It is a period piece, and Mr. Lincoln did have a 4-poster bed. But this is not it. We actually lost Abraham Lincoln's bed in a weird twist of fate. When he was elected president and they moved away from Springfield, moved to Washington, they did not sell this house. They rented it out because they intended to return here and live. When he was done being president, they were going to come back and, he said, pick up just like nothing ever happened. So they rented out the house, and the man that they rented it to, first of all, was a friend of Mr. Lincoln's, and he used quite a bit of the furniture. He happened to use Mr. Lincoln's bed, and he moved a few years later. No record as to whether he asked then President Lincoln if he could take any of the furniture out of his house when he moved. It's a little late now, but he did take the bed with him when he moved to Chicago. And he happened to be living in Chicago in 1871 when the Great Chicago Fire tore through town. So, yeah, we lost Abraham Lincoln's bed, guys, in the Great Chicago Fire. One of those weird pieces of historical trivia that you'll never need to recall ever again, but now you can file it away. It is true. But we do have Lincoln pieces in the room. That is his walnut wardrobe back there in the left-hand corner. Whatever clothing or personal effects he kept in that cabinet, he would have been in there every day. The certainly think it looks a little small for someone 6'4", right? It is a little small for someone 6'4", but it was a very average piece of furniture in many ways. Average size, average in price. It was not expensive, but it was one of the first things that Lincoln could afford to buy for himself when he came to Springfield as a young man. So the fact that he kept it for 17 years after he clearly could have upgraded, right? The fact that he didn't do that speaks some to his character, I think, right? You know, he was a pretty modest guy. And maybe had a little sentimental attachment too, just because, again, it was one of the first things he could afford to buy for himself. Well, in Mrs. Lincoln's room back here, we're not going to pause and talk in there. It's not quite as big a room, and it gets really kind of crowded. But there are a few things that you can see as you go through her room. There is a small rocking chair and footstool near the window that belonged to her. It's called a sewing rocker. Remember, she did love to sew. She does have another sewing table near that little rocking chair as well on the other side of the stove. There is a chest of drawers that belonged to her on this far wall back here. That's one of the oldest pieces in the house. Dates to the 1820s. It actually came to Springfield with Mary Todd before she ever knew a guy named Abraham Lincoln. And there is a dress on the bed that is a period dress, but not Mrs. Lincoln's. But it's an interesting piece to talk about because it's a very deep emerald green color. Does anyone know what a dressmaker would have used in Lincoln's time to dye fabric that deep green color? Any ideas? They actually used arsenic. So, yeah. Sometimes I'm amazed that people lived as long as they did with some of the things that they did, but you know, they didn't know what they didn't know. So
they also use arsenic to tint some of the wallpaper.
They did. Yeah. So like the green wallpaper over there in the guest room, same thing. Yep. So that, you know, that's reproduction, of course, but yes, back in the day, it would have been. So all right, we will make our way through Mrs. Lincoln's room. It could have been us, or it could have been the group downstairs. There's a group behind us. Robert was about, what was he, 56? He would have been 13 at the time. And so eldest son gets his own room for a little while. Willie and Tad, youngest two boys, they would have shared their mother's room. There's 10 years difference in age between eldest son Robert and youngest son Tad. Willie and Tad were still pretty small, and they would have shared their mother's room over here. They would have had a trundle mattress that pulled out from beneath her mattress and shared her room over here until Robert went away to boarding school and then was accepted to Harvard in 1859. And when he left, little brothers happily took over big brother's room. So we see it decorated for Willie and Tad Lincoln there. The door behind me doesn't go anywhere. It's the entrance to the old loft. So all they did was really wall off the stairs, the other side of the stairs that we came up a minute ago. But initially that's how you would have gotten into that smaller loft area before the full second story was on the house here. The door on my right at the end of the hall that's closed, that's a trunk room, just a giant closet. That's what it was for the Lincolns. It's kind of still what it is for the Park Service. But you notice that there were not closets in the bedrooms. That was typical of the era. Closets were considered rooms just like any other, and people had to pay taxes on the number of rooms, okay? Sometimes it was known as a door tax, right? So the Lincolns, you know, if you could afford it, like the Lincolns, you would have had one big room, as they did here, to store everything. Otherwise, you would have just relied on the wardrobes and the armoires and things like that that are in the other rooms here. On my left at the end of the hall is the hired girls' room. So we'll talk, we'll all get a chance to get a peek in there in just a few minutes. But a couple of things about the hired girls that lived, or that worked for the Lincolns. They were typically mid-teens or so in age, unmarried women, because married women didn't work outside the home back then. They would have been often from immigrant families. There were a lot of immigrants coming into Springfield during the years that the Lincolns lived here, and even beyond that. We know that they had girls from Ireland, Germany, and Portugal who worked for them. They also had at least one freed African-American girl who worked for them. Her name was Mariah Vance. Mariah is a really interesting study in and of herself. She remained friends with Robert Lincoln throughout the rest of her life. So the girls don't have to live here. I'm moving up just because the tour is behind me back here. The girls don't have to live here, right? But it makes sense for them to do that. They do get their room and board here, and again, they are paid for their work. So in 1860, their hired girl made $1.50 a week. How much did Mr. Lincoln pay for the stereoscope downstairs? $20. So if we took $1 from 1860 and we said we wanted to put that into today's money, right? It's a little over $35. So in terms of that, you know, their hired girl in 1860 is making, what is that, a little over $50 a week, right? Remember, she's an unmarried woman. It's a way for those immigrant girls to help their families get established here in their new home city, right? So again, you know, she's not doing too bad, and she's, you know, she is a paid employee. So as we pass her room, one thing I want you to take note of is none other than the flooring. Those are the only original floorboards left here in the house. So take a look at that, and then we'll make our way downstairs into the kitchen. It'll be a tight fit, but we'll make it work. They did once they put this full second story on.
At one point they had to get that.
Well, at least 4, yeah.
But I'm just saying that back then that was pretty complicated.
They are the original.
They're original houses?
Yeah, all of them are the original ones, except for the large brick one that's right up, it will be up here.
Okay.
Just a couple houses away. It is a reproduction, but all the others are the original houses in the neighborhood. All right, everyone, take just a moment and get a feel for the size of this room. It isn't a very big space, okay? It is, however, almost identical in terms of square footage to the log cabins that Abraham Lincoln was born and raised in Kentucky and then in Indiana in his early life. So until he was 22 years old and he lived out on his own for the first time, he lived in a space the size of this room with several members of his family. There were 7 or 8 people that existed day to day in a space this size, right? You know, I mean, this is it. This is all you've got. Contrast that with February 1861. And President-elect Abraham Lincoln is getting ready to leave Springfield. He's going to go right up the road here a few blocks, get on a train, and go live in the White House for the next 4 years. And he closes his front door out there for the last time. He says goodbye here to a home that's almost 3,000 square feet. And when we consider that 25 years before that, in 1837, when Abraham Lincoln arrived in Springfield, he had a brand new law license in hand. He had just passed the bar exam, but the horse that he used to get to Springfield was borrowed. He couldn't afford to buy one. And everything that he owned was in the 2 saddlebags that were slung across that horse's back. Take a look around. He did pretty well for himself, didn't he? Yeah. He made a lot of memories here. And he left a lot of things for us to think about and to continue to learn from. The Lincoln piece in this room is none other than the cook stove. That is Mrs. Lincoln's original cook stove. It was a gift from Mr. Lincoln in 1860, the summer before he was elected president. He spent some money in 1860, right? He bought her that stove. $25 he paid for that. How much did he pay for the stereoscope? I'm just keeping things in perspective is all. But yeah, $25. It was one of the latest models out of New York. Had that handy dandy little feature on the front there, that little warming tray. Keep in mind, that stove is cast iron. So when there's, you know, when it's hot, every surface on it is hot. So see where the irons are sitting out front there, right? That was you know, state-of-the-art stuff, right? Mrs. Lincoln loved her new cook stove until she got it. For the 17 years she had lived here, she and the hired girls who helped her to do some of the cooking, they would have cooked every meal, every day, over an open fire. You see where the wall comes out behind the stove? That was part of the fireplace. Mrs. Lincoln was, again, over the moon happy to get her much more efficient, much cleaner, much safer way to cook meals for her family. In fact, She loved it so much that a few months later, when Mr. Lincoln did win the election and they realized they were going to be moving to Washington and they've got to figure out what they're going to do with all their stuff because they've got to move, she insisted that her nearly 500-pound cast iron cook stove was going to be loaded up and taken with them to Washington. Mr. Lincoln said, "Mother, there are cook stoves in Washington already. And when you get there, you're not going to have to cook on one anymore." So they left her stove behind. So. All right, the white door over there just goes out onto the back porch. And across the porch there is an entrance to a pantry or a dry storage area. We'll see that in just a minute when we get outside. You're welcome to spend as long as you like in the backyard. In the far left corner of the backyard is a location where the Lincolns had an outhouse. It's not the original little building, although it is a period building. It came from a farm nearby here, but it is, again, a location where they did have a privy or an outhouse. There's also a structure out here that looks like a barn, not the original building, but it's the footprint where the Lincoln barn stood. There are two exits out of the yard. I believe they have this gate open. There should be one open right here, and there's one at the far right corner of the yard whenever you're ready as well. All right, guys, well, this does conclude the interior portion of the tour. On behalf of the National Park Service, it has been my pleasure to take you through Mr. Lincoln's home today. I hope you have enjoyed it as well. I'm going to be around for a few minutes outside if anybody has any questions out there as well. We're going to go out this door right here. There is just a small step down, so watch your step as we...
Okay, so as we move, the next stop here is the outhouse. This is deluxe. 3 places. Yes. 3 toilets, you might say, in the outhouse. Of course, you got the breeze coming through, not there, but also there, 2 ways. Of course, they had the door here that would have closed in front, and like I said, the outhouse. Then we move this way, and as we're coming through, you can see we were walking here, and there is a path here as you're going. Sorry, not doing very well there. And then this is the back side of the Lincoln residence right here. Okay, what's ironic, take note, okay, you figure how many years, over 100 years this was built, they lived in this, and then if they were here today and they walked out, okay, if they walked out of their house and they looked, in their case it'd be to the left, whoa, what the heck? Mary, did this grow up overnight? Think about that, how times have changed. All right, so once the tour is done, you can walk around the Lincoln house as we did in the back, and we are making our way, as Mason is showing us, to the front. Now, keep in mind, as they stated at the beginning, this is what it would have looked like back in the day when the Lincolns were here. Now, don't get me wrong, even though we can see things way down there past, of Springfield, but everything else here. And there's a couple of houses we're going to take a look at. We get the one over here. Oh, let me do this. We get to look at this one, and then we're coming over here and we get to look at this one. So we turn our camera to Mason. Which one are we going to, Mason?
That one.
We're going over here. Okie dokie, let's do it. Here we go. Okay, so the house that we're in, I just showed you the pictures, are the ones, the people that lived here throughout the years before it was finally restored by the National Park System. Of course, you had the Springers, then the Arnolds, the Cooks, and now the Davidsons. And like I said, this is where it all took place for these folks. And of course, if we look out window over here, let me see if I can get a better view for you guys. All right, over that way would have been, no, I'm at the wrong spot. Hold on, gotta turn this way. There we go. Right across here, it would have been the Lincolns. Let me try and do this. There's the Lincoln house. Right there we go. Sooner or later, I'd remember where I was at.